Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ergo Prism YouTube channel. I'm here today with a very notable guest. This is the business manager for Ergo, Joseph Armeanio. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So right off the bat, for those people out there that don't know what you do, what exactly does a business manager do in terms of being at the head of a project like Ergo?
Well, basically, I came onto the Ergo team to help Alex formalize kind of the back end. At one point, Ergo was running as a DAO, and that worked for a period of time to bootstrap the ecosystem. But there comes a point where you're signing contracts with larger entities. So you need essentially a legal counterparty that's liable in that type of position. And so on the back end, the first thing I did was work to establish a nonprofit in Singapore. That way, we can start to do business more internationally, because at the point where I started, we were kind of in obscure exchanges. After that, we worked with a firm in Malta to assess the legal aspects of ERG in terms of it, get an opinion whether or not it would be considered a security in different jurisdictions. I've signed a couple of contracts with exchanges, helped organize teams. And, at this point, I regularly am in contact with various exchanges, the market makers that the exchanges require, the marketing team, the developers, just trying to organize payment flows, that kind of thing, and also work with Alex to scope out the longer term plan for Ergo.
So in a blockchain that is striving to stay on track with first principles, Bitcoin has their own foundation, and they have a bunch of core developers as well that are formally recognized as people that help to implement new BIP proposals, right? Do you think this is pretty much fundamentally necessary in order to have a decentralized protocol? No matter how much you want to take individual actors out of the picture, it is fundamentally necessary to at least have a small legal team that can actually, human beings that can actually write these sort of contracts and get listed on exchange. There has to be some sort of entity on the other side.
There's two questions there. There's two questions. And in terms of like the development side, I actually don't think it's needed, right? But in terms of more of the business side, unfortunately, it's a temporary, it's a temporary necessity.
Right.
At some point, I would like to see, Ergo hit to the point where, we have enough market adoption, we have enough documentation that if an exchange wanted to add us, they can, right? They have the ability to do that. They have engineers that can integrate tokens, right? You look at Bitcoin, exchanges were built around Bitcoin versus, Bitcoin going to exchanges and saying, hey, list us, right?
Yeah, right.
So I think that to some degree, there's a certain threshold where exchanges will take the initiative and do that themselves, but you kind of have to bootstrap that. That doesn't just happen. So in terms of the business side, I would just say it's a necessary evil, hopefully temporary. But on the developer side, I don't necessarily believe that's the case. Ergo, was born from a DAO, and it operated under a DAO for a long time. Now, there are always trade-offs, right? The trade-off with DAOs is sometimes they can be a little bit messy in terms of, getting people to fully interact. When you have people that aren't like employed under some form of contract, sometimes they can, let's just say, slack off a little bit or lose focus. So there are always trade-offs in that case, but I really believe that a decentralized development community really doesn't need a single entity. But we're doing business in a world where you have to have legal, counterparties. So You know, in that sense, we have a temporary role to fill.
Right. Yeah, you kind of have to retrofit the way you want things to function in the future into the existing system of now, how business has always been done.
Yeah,
And that requires that. Yeah.
It's a challenge. You know, longer term, I would like to see the Ergo Foundation focus on two things: core development and education. At some point, market access will basically be, you know, to the point where we're on big exchanges, and at that point, little ones can add us, right? In terms of marketing, at some point that should shift to projects that are actually building on top of Ergo. And we're starting to already see that. You know, in an example, we have this ErgoHack Fest that's being sponsored by ErgoPad, right? At some point, I believe people that are actually building businesses or applications on top of the network should actually be the ones that, you know, go out and market what they're building. And certainly the foundation needs to be in sync with them to make sure that, you know, our longer term path in terms of the core protocol supports what they're trying to do. But, you know, there's this tendency in this space for probably more the investor side to want a gimmick, right? It's like, give me a message to sell Ergo. And it's like, well, we're trying to be an open and neutral network. So, you know, hopefully we grow to the point where we support a variety of solutions. And, you know, what we need to do is we need to focus on the tools that developers need, kind of the open source frameworks to bootstrap the educational process and get developers involved. But we really shouldn't be saying Ergo is X, you know, we're here for X. We're an open network, right? We don't have the ability to police who builds or, you know, say you can't build this, you should build this. That kind of defeats the point. And to some degree, I think in our industry is dangerous.
You care to elaborate on that?
Sure. I'll use Ergo's past as an example, right? We are working on a new framework for Oracle data, right? Basically, where you take Oracle data from multiple sources, you compile it, average it, and you pass it on to smart contracts. And the goal there is to say, okay, well, if you're going point to point, you're coming in with the assumption that the data is good. And, you know, it's kind of like you're either pregnant or not, right? There's no middle there. You know, if you got a problem, you're going to have a problem. If that assumption breaks, you're in trouble. Versus if you compile data from multiple sources, you have the ability to kind of offset potential damage from corrupted data. Now, our community got really excited about this. We've had an Oracle running, you know, since March of, what was that, 2021 when stablecoin launched. And, you know, everyone said, oh, we're going to be the Oracle for Cardano, which really doesn't make sense because, again, open networks, right? Projects are going to choose partners, and that comes down to efficiency and service and a lot of different things. And the reality is, where we sit today, Cardano doesn't really support oracles yet. That's coming up in the next hard fork. So, you know, people kind of built this narrative and went out and shared it. And even though long term, is that going to happen? Sure. It creates a certain false expectation for like an investor that's watching, where they may say, oh, well, you know, I heard Ergo was an oracle for Cardano. And it's like, well, that's, you know, in terms of our tooling, that's like a tiny little aspect of our capabilities, number one. And number two, it's a matter of saying, okay, well, where are we today? And what do we need to do today to build in multiple use cases? So sometimes when you get kind of the gimmicks and hypes of this space, it takes away from kind of the reality and the progression of things, if that makes sense. And that can be dangerous because if you lose trust within a community, nobody is going to be interested in your project. Trust in a way, trust is probably the most valuable asset in life, if you really think about it. The people you trust, the relationships you have, that needs to be something that even if it's not the sexiest answer short term, that's something that we really need to be cognizant of, and kind of just transparency and trust is going to long-term build confidence in Ergo.
Do you feel a sense of frustration with the way the DeFi space currently is usually giving the types of things that DeFi usually gives importance to? You talk about news, you talk about gimmicks, but Ergo's, from my understanding, is one of the very few projects that's trying to think long-term and do it in a responsible dad-like manner versus, let's go out and run with the Cardano agenda of, hey, we're going to be the Oracle provider and things like that. Like, news is usually, especially with Ergo, since it is like a network that it can be kind of difficult to conceptualize for the average person unless they really focus in on getting involved in the community and really reading the blogs and other documentation, which, in my opinion, is kind of heavy on the developer side. And some of those things can kind of seem like a foreign language to the average person. Do you kind of feel a sense of frustration trying to do all these responsible things in a space that, as we see with current news of May 10th, May 11th of 2022, is obviously not mature enough yet to kind of appreciate the things and the notions and ideas that you guys are trying to bring to the table?
No, that doesn't frustrate me at all. It's the right thing to do, in my opinion. It's one of those things where when the average user can interact with applications on top of Ergo, they'll understand how it works, right? If I were to say, okay, well, I'm going to take your cell phone out of your pocket and let's walk through the operating system, the hardware, the connectivity capabilities of it, the average user would probably not be able to follow that. But if you give a seamless user experience, you give them kind of the dApps, the interaction, they understand what it does, not necessarily how it works. And so for us, I think providing, tools to developers to build applications that then will, give users the experience to understand, what's happening, how it works, and how they can use it is
right.
The best long-term path.
Yeah.
In terms of DeFi, no, I fully understand that, our space is ripe with people that, the simple word are greedy. They don't really want to read into things and understand the assumptions and or risks involved. And there are some people that I would use the word are predatory and you kind of take advantage of, a consumer that is greedy. If somebody's trying to give away their money, there's going to be someone in this world that steps up to take it. That's just reality. Now, is it something that frustrates me as a whole with the space? It's sad, my opinion. A good example would be like this week, the hot news is UST, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that the guy that, kind of led that development will be fine. He's got contacts, he has business experience, he'll be able to reinvent himself. But when you have $40 billion pulled off the table, that's a lot of retail that probably will not be fine. Right. And so hopefully, and I say that kind of somewhat sarcastically because I don't think anything's going to change, but hopefully it gets a certain subset of people to wake up a little bit and say, okay, well, if I'm going to put money that I worked for into something, I need to at least understand the risks.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And, sometimes in our space, if you talk about risk, right? If you talk about, okay, well, what needs to change or what isn't working, that's automatically fun and you're attacked. And, people kind of are more interested in defending where they've put their money than actually looking into it. And in my opinion, that is a very, very ignorant it's a very ignorant way of living. You understand your risks when you're into things. If you're going to buy a house, probably get it inspected. Make sure there's not lead paint, there's structural issues or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. To kind of put reality as well in context, the kind of unique, unprecedented time that we're living in, Ergo was the mainnet was launched in July of 2019. By March of 2020, you have the pandemic. At least in the US, you have all of this inflationary free money going around. People think, I don't know how in the world if the Treasury and the US and the Federal Reserve are supposed to be composed of some of the smartest people that understand economics, why they think flooding the market with free money without any economic output beneath it would actually help and not create the type of situations we're seeing right now. But it does feel like a lot of people that didn't necessarily need that money, although there are plenty of people that did. I don't understand that either. There was no sort of, if you apply for some sort of welfare or something or unemployment, you do have to have some proof of necessity. This was just a blank check given to everybody. And a lot of people just felt definitely at the time, well, I'm locked up at home. Bitcoin seems to be doing well. Let me just park that money that I don't necessarily need, that disposable income, and let's try to duplicate it. So I think since most people that are on the retail side now, most of them probably, I don't know the percentage, but I would assume the majority of retail investors in crypto are all 2020 pandemic era onward, the ones that have joined, because it was such a small landscape prior to that. And now we've already kind of started on the wrong foot of, well, the middle class is dwindling. I need to duplicate my investments. I need yield aggregators. I need 100% back. I even saw, and this is crazy, but I saw a child, I consider anybody under the age of 30 a kid. I'm a kid, showing like a $1.5 million, this was a TikTok, some Cardano influencer that, she managed to retweet and stuff because of the UST. But basically he was, and this is like kind of my point here, like it was a TikTok of a $1.5 million house, a kid giving financial advice on how to get this house for less because he was going to put the down payment at a certain amount and he could use a yield aggregator backed by UST to basically pay off the mortgage month by month. And this is something like, I'm not Gen Z. I'm sure you're a millennial. I don't understand also kind of, there doesn't feel like there's a lot of accountability in terms of how people influence one another online. Like I'm sure that TikTok made perfect sense before UST crashed, or when Bored Ape and all these other NFT projects help people think that they could just become millionaires overnight, and some of them actually did. There is some that does coincide with the American dream that a small amount of people do actually achieve it, but everybody dreams that they can, and then they just kind of, people invest primarily with their emotions. So there's so much there. I don't want to sidetrack too much into that, but it does feel like we've set a bad starting point for the majority of retail investors that are 2020 onward. Well, and that Ergo is kind of going in the opposite direction. And that's partially why, people argue that we're under the radar, because a responsible approach isn't as sexy.
Yeah, well, the reality is since 2020, it's been favorable winds, right? Things have, gone in the right direction. And the reality is life doesn't always work like that. We're seeing that kind of now where, you have trends in broader markets that you have to be aware of. In terms of like social influencers, I wouldn't recommend anyone listen to anybody. What they need to learn to do is they need to learn to think for themselves and teach themselves. Now, you have a variety of resources, but you have to ask, what is this person's intent, right? And sometimes in terms of marketing and media, I think that the intent is simply to sell something.
That's pretty much why marketing exists.
Yeah, no, I think there are also let's say some resources that do offer pretty valuable information, and you can really learn and dive into things, but that takes work, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's let's look at like this UST example where you had basically gamified inflation. You had some scheme that kind of incentivized users to hold and lock their tokens to mint stable coins and get a nice APY. After that whole thing, kind of blew up, do I think the space is going to change now? No, I mean, I'm sure give it a couple of months and it'll be about the next dog coin or the next, kind of scheme that if you really take it apart and look at how it functions, there are some major concerns that some people have had for a long time, but, it wasn't, something that was popular or listened to. Why? Because, if somebody is kind of attached to a certain outcome and you get in the way and say, hey, slow down, a lot of the times you're the enemy, even if you're trying to help.
Yeah. There seems to be like embedded in human nature that there's always going to be a portion of the population that wants a lottery ticket and the hopes and dreams. I mean, how do you think lottery jackpots they manage to get to such big levels? I mean, it's on the backs of people hopefully giving away money in exchange for this tiny minuscule percentage that is not even conceivable if you don't look at it on paper, that they might actually win the whole thing. And maybe you're right. Maybe DeFi is going to, that's kind of the gift and the curse of it, that anybody can enter. You don't have hopefully as many centralizing entities, and based on public opinion, certain projects will go up to the moon. And yeah, it seems to be kind of tethered in.
I think DeFi has, certainly a place and it is really still a green pasture, but things need to be built properly and they need to have staying power. If you look at something that is going to exist not for, a year or 2 years, but what about a decade or, decades, or perhaps, even longer, they're going to be engineered very differently. The mindset of that is going to be much more focused on the stability and practicality of the economics of the protocol or contracts versus the short-term, tokenomics. That's been a really popular aspect of our industry probably since 2020. Is everyone saying, oh, well, what is the tokenomics? What is the tokenomics? Because, there are certainly kind of like the token games that do incentivize, a period of time where things go up really quickly. But, I have to, step back and say, okay, well, from the longer term perspective, does this have any staying power, value, and does it make economic sense?
Yeah, I would hope the majority of the newer Ergo members have been people that naturally, and I put myself in this category, have fallen into that trap of looking for the next thing. You made your profits. Now we got to look low market cap and we have to keep finding these gems until you finally get, hopefully, fatigue and you want something with actual a long-term sustainable pathway, because you know so much about crypto and the potential, hopefully, but you actually just, it's kind of like college students sleeping with a lot of people, and then eventually hopefully you grow up enough and you're mature enough to say, I just want a reliable long-term partner that will provide a benefit and a qualitative
Ability without
yeah,
abuse.
yeah, yeah. You gotta get something that will bring quality into your life. And in crypto, there's so much potential, but as we see with Ethereum and Bitcoin, there's kind of we see that those protocols don't scale properly due to their limitation. So in Bitcoin's case, it's definitely there's kind of like very little tolerance for saying that there could be any sort of flaw or anything that could be improved outside of a soft fork. And you know, we don't want a Bitcoin Cash. We don't want all these hard forks, at least in my opinion, but there has to be evolution of technology. Imagine if we just stuck with a 2007 era iPhone, because it was the original smartphone that we all came to know and love. And we never said, like, you know, we can have Android phones and we can have better iPhones and we can do all these things, or even have apps on the iPhone, right? Smart contract functionality. Because if you do that, you know, you're the enemy of the Bitcoin, the one true cryptocurrency. And then with Ethereum, we see all the things that came out of that. So it just feels like if you really look long and hard, you do need some sort of protocol like Ergo that tries to ambitiously take the best of both of these first and second generation blockchains and try to improve them and kind of give people a base layer that's kind of a sandbox where you can do whatever you want with it as long as you're able to program it. If you can program it, you can make it feasible and make it happen. So I think that's immense power. And
no, the most important aspect of that, in my opinion, is just really repeating and trying to get people to understand the value of first principles.
Right.
You know, what is decentralized? What does that mean? Usually it means people need to interact. They need to host. They need to participate. You know, decentralization in terms of like an ecosystem is localized power. In terms of privacy, why is that important, especially in this world? You know, that's probably not going to be the most popular message longer term in terms of like full. There are going to be jurisdictions that have an issue with that, but you know, the reality is, if you have a global network, you know, some people will say, oh, you know, confidentiality is enough. You can, you know, have confidentiality with a centralized entity. And, you know, around the world, you see governments collapse. What happens to that confidential information? Usually it goes to some party, you know, perhaps the new form of government.
Or you get hacked. Or you get hacked, and your credit score is all over the internet.
You know, privacy really is something that, in my opinion, is very sad to watch. An industry that calls itself cryptocurrency, crypto meaning hidden,
yeah,
you know, and that people are slowly kind of backing away from, you know, the core principle. Why do we use cryptography? You know, the big part of that is because it provides privacy. So I think that's something that at least the Ergo Foundation just needs to talk about. First principles, you know, how does this make sense? How can people protect themselves? Encourage people that come in and develop in our ecosystem to build in a way that's transparent, it's auditable, and you know, it has open assumptions people can make.
Right.
You know, if assumptions were more open, talked about, and that was the discussion versus like, oh, what's gonna be the gym that's gonna go to the moon tomorrow, we would be so much better off in terms of how we design systems as an industry as a whole. It might be slower, but I think it would have much more staying power. Solid foundation is where to start. You know, and unfortunately, that's going to be rare, in my opinion. It already is, looking at the space.
Joseph, I feel like you have a wealth of information. I just wanted to ask you, how long have you been in the crypto space? And where did you manage to amass so much information? And do you have a developer background at all?
The first question is I've been watching the crypto space since, I don't know, 2013 maybe. Back when Bitcoin was pretty young, when kind of the Ripple ICO happened, I was getting into the space at that point. And I've watched it over the years. I've kind of been in and out. I have, other things to do sometimes, but I've kind of watched the evolution in terms of like, okay, what's the long-term potential that people were talking about, over the years. And that's something that hasn't really been realized, in my opinion. Obviously you have kind of volatility over time in the space that's kind of created phases. And oftentimes those phases themselves are kind of short-lived, right? So even it's like, I don't know, there's this weird pattern in crypto where there's like a certain topic or sector of the industry that's sexy or hot for like 2-3 months, and then it rotates.
Yeah.
Oh, it's DeFi. Oh, it's, NFTs. Oh, it's
Metaverse.
gaming.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's metaverse. Oh, and the reality is, if you want to build a good game, that probably takes years. If you want to build a good, a solid DeFi protocol that's, very broad and robust, that's going to take a lot of time. But if it's one of those things where there's just like these quick rotations of money, right? That tends to, like, if you really step back and you look at crypto over a longer period of time, there tends to be like some market driven rotation of money. And, hopefully people, I guess, from the trading perspective, are early to the game because they don't really have much staying power or last. Now, will they bootstrap some innovation long term? I hope so. I really do hope so. But, I also understand like the reality of, if I'm going to be a game developer and build something that, is around for a decade, that's going to take a team and a lot of work. It's not going to spring up in 2 months. And then what was that game that was on that kind of had like its own little meteoric phase, Flappy Birds or something like that a while ago on the phone, where we get the Flappy Birds type thing. They're really popular for a really short period of time, but I think staying power is really the longer term goal. And sometimes crypto traders have a little bit of ADHD when it comes to understanding like the long-term work that's involved in a lot of these things.
Yeah, the metaverse stuff will be interesting to see how it plays out. It seems like a lot of companies sort of like privatize the ideas after they see that there's some potential there. Let's put in-game NFTs, and I don't know, Ubisoft, or let's have certain elements of like Michael Jordan having his own NFT collection or marketplace. And it kind of begs the question how long that can go for before, if ever, people see the beauty of actually having kind of decentralized platform where everybody can kind of interact with at least the majority of those elements, and not just have them scattered around in their little factions.
Yeah, you need to if you wanted to build some sort of like unified metaverse, the first thing you need is standards. Right?
Yeah.
If you don't have standards that allow things to be interoperable, all you're doing is building little bubbles.
Yep.
And so in terms of like the longer term trajectory of that, I don't see standards yet. So I can't say there's not value or speculation or business interest, but longer term, if you want to have an open source metaverse, let's start with standards. Otherwise, I just don't see how there's interoperability, and instead you build little fiefdoms.
Yeah, I mean, to the benefit of the ecosystem of the industry as a whole, it is it's so early and fledgling. Mm-hmm. I think of like airplanes and how you have to have certain standards after you start building the first one. They don't come around so soon. After you get the first plane off the ground, whatever aircraft. And I think there has to be some sort of standards, like you say, just from unfortunately, this is kind of the world we live in. There has to be some coexistence with governments and how they're able to identify and regulate certain things. Hopefully, as little as possible, but there will be some regulation, and those standards maybe they have to come from governments in the first place for kind of these little factions to fall in line, and then work on interoperability. Otherwise, I don't think from a decentralized perspective that most people and most businesses are just going to open their arms and say, let's all get together and let's live in a kind of like this symbiotic, interoperable, competitive environment, you know?
Well, to some degree, in terms of like cross-chain interop and let's say that future, I personally am a little skeptical, if I'm totally honest. The reason why is because you can inherit external vulnerabilities, right? You can use the example right now. You have, UST deleveraging and whatever was in their portfolio backing that is now getting sold on the open market. So there's like a cross contamination of risk that can occur.
Yeah, like wormhole.
Yeah,
what happened with wormhole, like
so to some degree, I do think that interop makes sense in terms of arbitrage trading and DeFi, but I'm not in the camp that is fully convinced that interoperability, or for lack of a better analogy, it's like, okay, we're going to wire everybody together so they transfuse blood with each other, right? Sometimes things don't mix, sometimes things are diseased. There's risk there that really needs to be understood. Now, hopefully, if a platform becomes large enough, I think to some degree we've already seen this with probably Ethereum as a good example, where they have a lot of complexity that's built on top of that base protocol. They have a lot of variety of solutions to where I think longer term, Ergo could be its own ecosystem that is more, I don't want to use the word isolated, but just built on top of a single framework. So you don't inherit all of that external risk.
Yeah, I think of the Rosin Bridge, for example, right? If I remember correctly, smart contract deployment from a foreign blockchain the smart contracts would only have to be deployed on the Ergo side, correct?
Yeah.
Not on the foreign blockchain necessarily. Does that open up any risk for, as you say, cross contamination or inheriting vulnerabilities?
To some degree, sure. If you wrap an asset from another chain, you bring it onto Ergo, and then that asset loses value, it just lost whatever value it represented in the Ergo ecosystem.
Anything beyond that though?
Not really. But that could be a big problem if you have, let's say, a stable coin that starts to support a large part of DeFi in your network that suddenly disappears. That's a big vulnerability.
Is there any way to temper that vulnerability, or once you open that bridge, literally once you cross that bridge, you're opening up the floodgates to your brand kind of being susceptible. But I do see Ethereum almost like, since so many people understand that so well, they do understand a lot of meme tokens and things that can be built on top of it over time, that they kind of are able to separate the two entities as this failed project that lives on top of Ethereum, or a failed NFT collection that lives on top of Ethereum, not necessarily Ethereum being responsible for any of these faulty kind of toxic or failed projects living on top of it, right?
Yeah, there's two opposing energies in a way. On one side, the plus of a lot of interoperability is potential liquidity, and that is sexy. People love that. I can bring a lot of value into my network. The trade-off for that is probably external vulnerabilities that you bring into the ecosystem that may not be understood, or the reality is, like, as a foundation member, I'm not going to be the one that makes this decision, but I can talk about it, right? There's a trade-off here, and so I could ask the question, okay, well, let's say you had a protocol on a different chain that was proven to be pretty resilient and had staying power. Do you really need to wrap that and bring it on, or could you simply build something that serves the same function in Ergo? Sometimes I wonder if we're not going to have like the same model in different jurisdictions versus, McDonald's everywhere, if that makes sense. The interoperability is kind of, it may lead to really large protocols that exist in multiple ecosystems. And, you kind of get into the reality where you fly halfway around the world and there's Starbucks, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there are certain things, like I think of Starbucks not being successful in Australia, for example.
Sure.
but yeah, by and large, yeah. Going back a question or two ago, I asked you if you had a developer. I asked you like 3 questions at once, but
Sure.
If you had a developer background at all,
Nope.
and no,
but I'm learning.
You have to learn. You have to learn just by interacting with all these elements. There's no way for you to really conceptualize them without actually learning a bit of like smart contracts and how those look, and how things are programmed. Yeah.
The reality is I try to come from the perspective that I need to know when I'm stupid and I need to ask for help. Like that in life has served me really well. Just that simple principle. There's nothing wrong with not knowing something, but when you don't know something, know that you don't know it, and then get help and work, and eventually you'll improve. So I'm not going to say that I'm the smartest character in the world. Definitely not. I'm not going to say that I'm the greatest business mind in the world. Definitely not. But I try to know when I'm stupid, and I try to find resources to assist me when I'm in that, position. And that's helped me a lot. I generally ask a lot of questions, and I'm continuously trying to learn, understand, and improve. I think that is a really good principle for especially new participants in this industry. You can look at the green lines and the red lines, and it's exciting, but before you take on risk, try to know what you don't know right now,
which is a whole lot.
Yeah, that's a life journey,
Yeah, it's kind of, I'm gonna jump around a bit on the questions and then get back into the Hack Fest, the Ergo Hack Fest that's currently going on right now. And I'm actually going to go to one of the last questions now that we've kind of brought some of the potential of DeFi and the overall ignorance that, even the smartest people have a vast amount of ignorance about what's possible with DeFi as they currently, as they actively try to seek out new examples on how to do things and adding things to GitHub. I don't think Vitalik even envisioned for Ethereum NFTs originally. I'm not sure about that, but he seemed very surprised by it. And when he was asked, like, what is the most like unexpected thing to come out of Ethereum, he said NFTs.
I can see that.
Yeah, like something that you would think all these very smart developers and visionaries would have thought of would be possible just a few years down the road, and they didn't see it, a few years prior. So going back to kind of that final question, what do you see? Where do you see Ergo realistically being in the future? Like, what role will Ergo ultimately play long term in this entire space? How do you envision growth, and to what extent and duration of time do you see yourself and the foundation playing a role in Ergo's ecosystem and its development?
It's a big question, Dumb.
I know it's a big question, but
okay. So let's start from the basis. Okay, one thing that I would love to see Ergo achieve long term is preserve GPU mining.
Oh.
Now, part of the reason why I would like to see GPU mining exist is because it allows people from around the world to enter into the crypto space without having direct liability in the crypto space, where instead of investing in a coin, they invest in a computer. Now, if somebody gets a computer, they start to learn. There are 1,000 different ways they can monetize that. And crypto is one. But I think that GPU mining offers a KYC-less entry into the space. And so I think that is going to, it simply transcends jurisdictions. If you're going to be decentralized, you need to be able to work around, you have a new leader elected that changes, a law to where now you can't buy. There's a lot of places in the world that don't have exchange infrastructure, or there's a lot of places in the world that people don't even have access to banks, right?
Yeah.
But if they have an internet connection, if they have hardware, at least they have an entry. And that eliminates a lot of dependencies.
Go ahead. I'll ask what I was going to ask after.
Sure. So that's one important aspect I would like to preserve. Mining, and a big part of that is simply because it opens the globe. It really does. Versus, okay, you have to have a bank account, you have to have infrastructure like an exchange in your country in order to enter the space. It eliminates that barrier of entry. So that's huge, my opinion. One thing I really like about Ergo, and it's probably one of the big factors that kind of led me to be a part of it, is the functional nature of how smart contracts work. If you really understand registers in smart contracts, your assumptions become a lot more transparent, right? In terms of, okay, well, what are the things that need to be verified in order for this smart contract to compile to true? So I think that offers a big benefit, not only in terms of like security long-term as things develop, but also from a user perspective where it's easier for community members. It's going to be easier for community members to take a contract, look at it and understand it versus something, like a Solidity contract that's all kind of coded in one long repository, basically.
ErgoScript is based on Scala, which is, I don't have a developer background, but it's based on sort of like it's its own language, but it's based off Scala, which is sort of like a more general purpose programming language, as I understand it. And that was intentional from the beginning, so it can be more simplified than having all these different blockchain programming languages, correct?
Yeah, and it was built from tools that were built in Scala. So if you look at ScoreX, right, which is kind of the prototyping tool that Alex built, that was built in Scala. So a lot of the tooling that kind of gave birth to Ergo was built in Scala, and Scala is it's a nice language, I think. It's general purpose. You can do a lot of things with it. Some people don't like the syntax, but that's okay. But in terms of like the average user, if you can, we have, let's say, DeCo available, where you can join their YouTube channel or their classes, and you can learn a little bit about ErgoScript, learn about their registers. And you have very defined kind of things that need to be verified in order for a contract to work. And you really just need to look at the registers to get a really basic understanding of how things are going to function. That takes work. But if you're going to take a significant amount of, let's say your assets or savings or money on hand, I would think you'd want to do a little bit of reading, right? I would hope anyway.
Do you think, this might be beyond the scope of our knowledge. There can be, as ASICs continuously evolve and improve for various reasons, that we can have sort of a ASIC that could be used as a GPU, as a sort of like a general purpose part for running video games and running all these things. With the right integrations, right? I know they're completely separate up. They have completely opposing roles, right? One is a singular case where you're just mining Bitcoin or any hard forks of Bitcoin, and the other thing can be used for a wide variety of things. Do you think we'll ever see like kind of a coalescence of these two things, and then that might blur the lines between what is ASIC resistant or what is GPU mineable?
Sure, it's not a black and white calculus at the moment. Even, you have field programmable gate arrays, which are kind of some middle. It's like a programmable ASIC, basically. If you look, a lot of that has to do with the let's call it an external dependency, which is the market and technology in that sector. Mm-hmm. AMD just spent $50 billion, I believe in February, buying one of the world's largest chip makers. And so what are their plans in terms of, integrating chips into their GPUs? Are they going to try to shift more towards field programmable gate arrays? I don't know. I would imagine so. So in a decade, we may have a very different GPU than we have now. But that was true if we look back 10 years ago, right? If you pulled a GPU from a computer 10 years ago and you compare it to something that is in your average personal computer today, they're not so similar. But the same is true with the cell phone. So yeah, that's something we have to watch and adapt. I don't know if ASICs themselves, in terms of like a singular circuit, will ever come about, but I do think that certainly FPGAs are something that we need to watch, because that's a technology that's developing in parallel, and looking at kind of the trajectory of general technology, and I would imagine that's going to be more popular in a decade. Now, the trade-off is, they're more efficient. Okay, maybe that's good, but the question is going to be, how broadly available are they? And that's really what I like about GPU mining, is that you don't have to have one singular card. You have a market that is pretty full of graphics cards, some of which are 5 years old, and they still mine Ergo. Now, are they the most powerful? No. Are they always the most efficient? That comes and goes depending on mining software, but it creates more of an open market.
Accessibility is key, and it's kind of central to Ergo's philosophy of inclusivity overall. It's kind of intertwined. If there were ever, now here's the thing I'm imagining, how now with EIP 27 and the miner rewards are going to drastically decrease, and I think it's over 80% over the next 5 years. Well, yeah, essentially, we're going from 63 down to 3. That's a dramatic reduction, right? And if there were ever to be ASICs on Ergo to mine Erg, would that be ultimately up to the miners to decide through a soft fork proposal?
No, it would probably be a hard fork at that point. But
just for people that don't know, sometimes, and myself included, the differences between a hard fork and a soft fork.
Sure, it has to do with backwards interoperability. You kind of change the network to the point where, effectively you kind of have a new network, because you lose some ability to interop with your past. That makes sense.
So we have like the reverse of an Ethereum classic at that point?
Yeah. You kind of, whenever you have a hard fork, you kind of have, in essence, a chain that becomes a new chain. You could think of it like that. So usually you'll have some period where you're going to have a hard fork, and it's like, okay, you try to carry data forward into the new chain. So to some degree, it's like a new generation, I guess, but you lose backwards compatibility.
Oh, wow.
Now, if ASICs came onto Ergo, that would be something that, the miners would decide. But, the reality is, if you look at Ergo's past, we already did have one hard fork where we changed the consensus to allow for mining pools. And that came about from the mining community.
But there wasn't a new chain from that, correct? Obviously.
Well, I mean, you still carried the same history forward, but it did kind of create an issue in terms of backwards compatibility, right?
So do you think a new chain was avoided because it was done so early on?
No, well, I don't think there was any value to fork. And, although it wasn't, although it didn't have 100% consensus, like EIP 27, why did we set the threshold at 90% instead of 51%? Because you really don't want to have, let's say, a lot of value when you have a major change that can split off into its own chain or ecosystem.
Do you think that's inevitable? Ergo will be hard forked at some point, since it is open source, regardless of whether it's because of a miners choosing ASICs. Just because the open source code and all the work Alex has done is just phenomenal.
The reality is, I imagine that there are already developers that are playing with it just for their own ability to create a localized environment and build on Ergo, where they have, a kind of a local chain that is based on our open source code. That's not Ergo. Now, the question is there any value there, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, the value and proof of work tends to follow the miners.
Yeah. So you think that actually would have a positive effect of technically kind of like the more hard forks there are of Ergo, which could be inevitable, the more miners we attract to the original network?
No, I don't know. I don't know if there's even going to be, let's say, like an open hard fork that someone is trying to, monetize and create a new network. I'm just saying it's open source code. I could start, a new chain just by copying everything, right? Now, would anyone want to come and play with me? Probably not. So there's that question. But the reality is, even with all of the forks of Bitcoin, some of them were quite interesting in terms of like the proposals and technology that people were trying to implement. They weren't really successful in terms of the market, but I don't think that type of experimentation is necessarily like a horrible thing. I just think if you want to try to keep a community together, you have to have a high threshold for consensus for change. And, for us, that 90%.
So, hey, everybody watching, he's not a developer. You can learn as much about the ecosystem as he has. It's pretty impressive how much you know. You seem to be very, very thoughtful always in your responses. It's very something else. What other things do you do with your time that you're willing to share other than focusing on Ergo?
Sure. When I live in Colorado, so when I'm not working, I'm on airplane mode and I'm in nature. I have a spot in the mountains, so I like to hike around. I like to track things, I like to build things. I'm somebody that if my hands are busy, I'm pretty peaceful. So I try to always have some little side project or madness that I'm working on that, I don't know, just keeps me busy, makes me happy. Busy hands make a peaceful mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how different the US can be as you get into different areas of it. That's really, I live in Florida, that's really, there's plenty of nature, but there's some sort of geographical romanticism when you have at least mountains and you have temperature changes and you have different types of animals and something about physically walking up a summit, it's kind of like biblical. And then you come right back down. So
I try to unplug. Great. Is in all honesty, if I'm not going to be focused on working, and I work, this is a technological industry, so I'm on the computer, the phone, this and that all the time. I don't want to be. I just want to enjoy life, so I try to be more present and get away from kind of a Luddite outside of my work, because, it's some people, that work on computers, they're happy to they end a Zoom call or meeting and then they open another program and that's their recreational time.
That would be sort of like, I'll be interviewing Alex in the near future. You would put Alex in that category as well?
No, I think he has the same balance from time to time. Does? Yes, he has to. You kind of have to unplug. Otherwise, the stress of just, screen time is killer.
Yeah, you get digital eye strain and many other things once you get into that level.
Yeah, you
Well,
got
that'll be
to connect
to
in
find out more.
reality, I think.
Yeah, I see Charles from Cardano is taking flights, and he's sort of in nature as well. It kind of seems like a prerequisite if you want to have like long-term staying power, so you don't go crazy.
I think. Yeah, well, I think it just requires like presence. If you want to be present in your life and really have quality outside of work, you have to learn to connect with things. And sometimes electronics interfere with our ability to be present and connect in our local environment.
Yeah.
So I think it's healthy to have kind of like the duality there if you're really heavy in that space. Otherwise, people that just they kind of lose connection to some degree. I think we even see that in like kids when they get addicted to their little phones. They kind of lose that ability to connect, at least when that stimuli is present. So
yeah, that's going to be interesting. Not in a good way. It'll be interesting to see how a newer generation grows up with these, and then the isolation being mandated, and it's a weird thing for sure.
Yep.
Yeah. So just a few last questions. Do you ever see Ergo and other serious projects in our space ever truly untethering from Bitcoin and Ethereum, sort of considering like they have such a strong presence and they form such a large percentage of the market, the current crypto market cap overall? So we just, we're kind of, Ergo could be doing as good as possible, but if something happens with Bitcoin, unfortunately, the price drops of Ergo. Do you ever think that we can like emancipate ourselves and other serious blockchains from those market valuations, just because hopefully over time, as the industry matures, people start to separate one thing from the other?
Well, I'm going to preface my answer by saying I guarantee I'm going to be wrong, because this is one of those areas where I know I'm stupid, right? But if I had to guess, I would say we're going to see like one of two paths for our space long term. Path one, we're going to probably see things become more integrated within the existing financial system, in which case, it'll all somewhat move together. The NASDAQ goes down, Bitcoin goes down, it kind of ripples across. It's like we're in like the same ocean, so to speak. The wave comes, everybody rises, everybody falls. Or we start to see more of a counter economic P2P system that is less connected to the existing financial structure and becomes more independent. And in that case, I think it may start to decouple a little bit from broader markets.
It's funny you say that, because that was kind of that's literally what Bitcoin originally set out to do.
Yeah.
And now it's a weird hypocrisy. I'm sorry for the maxis in Bitcoin space sometimes, but they give so much material. It's just sometimes it's hard to not criticize some things there, because it is the most prominent and it has the largest following. But
there's a lot of that. That's, in my opinion, longer term, what is better? Probably the counter economic thing, because I look at inflation, debt levels in countries, instability in markets, inflation, and I'm like, do we really want to marry with that? I don't know. Long term, I would much prefer to see something that is more independent, resilient, and resistant to control and regulation, because then you actually have the ability to build something different versus take something new and then engineer it to fit within something that doesn't work. I mean, in a way, it's funny. It's like you have a space that loves to kind of dunk on fiat, but then also wants to build stable coins, right? And it's like, well, to some degree, you're like mimicking a lot of things that are that you're talking about. They're unstable on one hand, and then on the other hand, you're kind of engineering the same system into what you build. So
I think people's values come out when largely depending on the news that they celebrate as well. If you're celebrating that a certain Swiss bank is going to allow for customers to have wealthy clients to have access to Bitcoin services, it just kind of seems
It's weird.
It's a weird thing.
Well, if you look at principles, right, the principles this industry was founded on really steers things in the direction of counter economics, P2P, and creating resilient systems. But there's been monetary incentive added on top that over time has become more and more popular. And, most of the like videos you'll see on crypto are, somebody with their mouth open talking about space, right? It's ridiculous. And that tends to move things more towards the, let's pair with existing systems and let's get liquidity. They can say whatever they want in terms of principle, but the bottom line is they're chasing liquidity. And so, if you plug into more money, you have more money coming into the space, you're going to make more money. But at what point does that kind of abandon the original vision and principles? And, you just are kind of marching towards some digital money that, is regulated, controlled, and really you lose the independence and resilience that crypto is even meant to be. It brings me back to what I was saying about privacy. If somebody doesn't support privacy, why do they support cryptocurrency? I don't know. To me, it seems fundamental.
It's really strange. You wouldn't want your bank information. Everybody agrees. I wouldn't want my bank information, all the transactions I do with that bank account to be public and out there and for everybody to see what I'm spending my buying power on. Yet with crypto, if you sort of advocate for privacy, there is this fear that you must love money laundering instead of it being a fundamental human right. Yeah.
I have one basic question to anybody who has that thinking. Why do you wear clothes? Why do you wear clothes? Maybe you have something to be ashamed about. Maybe you're trying to protect yourself for the weather, but think about it. That's basic privacy. You're hiding your body. Why?
Well, I'm not too far away from Miami, so I think privacy is not a major factor down there.
No, but that's an interesting question. It's the same. It's the same concept, right? To where it's like, okay, give me your bank account. Let me see your personal information. Get naked. All these things, we have this inherent ability. Like, no, we should create boundaries here because it's unhealthy. But suddenly you create a boogeyman, and then they try to flip the narrative where if you have boundaries, it's negative. In my opinion, that's a great recipe to control people. Everybody needs boundaries.
Yes, and most money laundering is done with dollars in cash anyway. Yeah. So it's not really a fair argument to make at all.
Yeah, and regulating
from principle. Yeah,
regulating crime is not exactly stop crime. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sometimes it incentivizes more depending on how certain.
You make a market.
You make a market that it helps to bring more. I guess there's more risk, but there's also more entrepreneurial promise for those willing to undergo those risks just because of the black market that you've just created by saying you don't want that market in the first place.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, why do you feel so many projects have ditched proof of work over the last few years? That was widely popular in the 2010s. And now they sort of normally opt for proof of stake. And do you think there's a strong case for proof of work making a bit of a resurgence as the crypto industry evolves?
It's a good question. Proof of stake, I think the biggest incentive for it is people capture inflation, right? So if I buy a token and I put it in a staking box, I get more tokens. That's a hard incentive to compete with, but it creates a lot of additional complexity that proof of work doesn't have to deal with. I'll use a good example, okay? DeFi. So in proof of work, you have a asset that is created by computational power and electricity costs, right? Then it's converted into some digital tokenized form. You come into a zero rate market. So if I'm going to build a DeFi protocol, that's going to offer some return. If I build something that creates a 1% return, a 2% return, it makes sense and it doesn't affect the potential security of the network. And proof of stake, you have to compete with the rate of inflation that the protocol sets. So if I have the ability to stake something and I get 5% return just by putting it in a staking box, everything that's under 5% really doesn't make any sense. Why would any user take on some mechanism of risk to get a return less than what the base rate of the protocol is? So everything, from there, in my opinion, there's not a lot of incentive to even build. Now, above that, what could potentially start to happen is people move their tokens from staking into DeFi, which potentially could affect some of the security assumptions of the network. Because rather than being staked and providing, kind of the security consensus for proof of stake, it would be in DeFi and seeking a return. So if, the rate of return goes too much higher than that protocol rate, you do have some potential, security changes that come about from token migration. So I think that having that neutral zero market rate is actually super valuable and is not something that people have really, we haven't really seen the two compete long term, but that's one thing that I'm very curious about, because the reality is in what is in the physical world, right? And outside of the funny money, internet money, if you can get a stable return on your investment, the percentages of that in relatively stable markets, are not as sexy as they are in DeFi or other tokenized environments. So sometimes those lower risk assets are low yielding. And traditionally it's like, okay, well, if you have a lower return, that is an indicator of stability. So I'm very curious long term to say, okay, well, if you have a protocol that, let's say has 8% inflation rate, everything that's under 8% makes no economic sense, because, the protocol is relatively risk-free. So it's going to be very fascinating to watch how that distorts markets in DeFi long term. Now, in terms of other use cases, I do think there's certain areas where proof of stake might prove to be more beneficial. But just in terms of like DeFi, I'm really curious how different base rates will affect different protocols.
Well, there's a lot there. Well, first, my opinions on that as well. I think proof of stake is just easier to centralize and easier to implement overall. Trying to attract miners, trying to convince people, exert energy, buy the hardware necessary to, upkeep the network is just a lot. It's a more challenging, although more promising task to undergo. And I think the environmental narrative is very skewed. I think that's usually what happens overall in environmental debate anyway. It's always going to have so many underlying layers that are very difficult to comprehend. And there's ultimately a lot of arguments to be made for different types of renewable energies, or if, what percentage of that is actually viable. I do have a history with the solar industry here in Florida. So that in of itself is just very complicated. When you have a utility company that actually has very low kilowatt hour, cents per kilowatt hour rate, and then the cost of solar panels in of themselves and things like that. So there's so much complexity. I think it's not fair for people to think, which is, it's always going to come to Bitcoin first, to just say, hey, proof of work mining is bad. It's bad for the environment. That's just that's just so basic and
Well,
so vague.
incentives matter, and I think that is probably one of the most popular things that come from, the marketing aspect of proof of stake communities. Incentives matter.
Yeah. It's a low resolution argument, and it starts from a premise: well, Bitcoin mining is bad, so therefore all proof of work mining is bad.
Therefore, we should absorb their value.
Yeah.
And then the reality is, I do think that if you have a situation where you have the ability to create a return above your input costs, that's great business. You should take advantage of it. And I do think that proof of work offers that in many cases.
Yeah. I mean, that's foundationally what any person opening up a small business does. So if you have all of these small actors kind of supporting a decentralized protocol, and you have the network stability, and you manage to successfully attract them, make the mining actually profitable long term, and then also get rid of 51% of tax as much as possible in accordance with all this trust. It's a very beautiful thing once it's pulled off successfully. I think it's just very hard to do. And if you start a new protocol and you say, well, I have proof of work or I have proof of stake as an option, I think it becomes very tempting to take the easier route. Or, in Cardano's case, it's not an easy route in Cardano's case, but I'm just saying in general that it just seems a lot easier if you're able to control more of the strings behind that and not even make it as decentralized. And do people even care if your protocol is decentralized? And I think we're seeing that with Terra and a lot of these other cryptocurrencies and projects, that people don't really, unfortunately, in this infancy of the industry, they don't really care as much as they probably should. And I'm hoping that the silver lining of this whole entire Terra Luna nonsense is that people begin to look at what they're investing in, as you mentioned before. And in Cardano, I mean, but if you see something go from $100 down to $2 in like the span of 2 days, I think, you're gonna think twice. I would hope, at least a little bit. You're more hesitant to invest in things. Just because it's on Coinbase or something like that doesn't automatically give it clearance that this is inherently a safe thing, and Coinbase has done their due diligence by auditing it the proper way, as from a first principles point of view. It's very complex. So
all of these things are hugely complex. Proof of work mining, will it concentrate over time? Usually it depends on market conditions. If you look at like entry, you have some areas like Florida where you can get really cheap kilowatt hours, in the right jurisdiction. You have other areas that may be paying, sometimes 4, 5, 6, 7 times the rate, depending on where they are and how their energy is produced. So, in a highly competitive environment, it does tend to create actors that will try to exploit whatever advantages they have. That's how markets are built. So there's always complexity, and I really think that it's one of those things that I can ask myself, okay, I'm stupid, I need to learn more. I'm stupid, I need to learn more. I'm stupid, I need to learn more. And I don't know where the bottom is,
Yeah. Does Ergo have any metrics on, I think this is really hard to do, but does Ergo have any metrics on the amount of miners that do mine Erg successfully and then actually hold it, or versus selling it? Is that possible? Or somebody that would have to be like a community driven thing?
Yeah, it would be really hard, because the best way to measure that would be to look at the pressure on exchanges, because obviously as they sell, they're going to move to exchanges. But then you have to factor in the fact that different mining pools have different payout periods. So there's not really a standard there. Plus everything is intermixed with market makers and traders. So, you could kind of get a messy guess at best, in my opinion. There's a lot of variables to look at. It'd be a neat experiment, though.
Yeah, it would be. Maybe for the upcoming ErgoHack, somebody can do that. I had an interview with Guap Swap, and I think that's, you know, at first it sounded so simple, like a decentralized miner swapping DApp that you could get paid out on a different token versus Erg. And it's like, oh, eliminating the step between you mining Erg and then taking to an exchange to sell it and then buy something else is incredibly rewarding. Like just giving people the options to be paid out in different tokens, especially those that over time, obviously, just like ErgoPad has been birthed out of the ecosystem, there's going to be a lot of projects that people, especially in certain jurisdictions where they're taxed differently, depending on when they sell, what they mine, and things like that. That's an incredibly, it seems like such a simple thing to do, but it's an incredible step forward. So I think when I first came into the Ergo community, I noticed that, especially you had a very strong, you put very strong importance on miners. And at first I didn't quite understand why the EIP voting was only reserved for miners. I'm like, hey, I'm a community member, I should be able to partake. But it's like, you don't necessarily have skin in the game in terms of supporting the network. You might support the community in a certain way, but if the network fails, everything fails. And that's kind of as I learned over time, that's kind of like the big thing. You know, if you don't secure the network, you don't have anything. And you're pushing that trust. Hey, let's get away from nanopool 51%. And that's so, you're trusting community members not only to use the equipment of GPUs properly and actually use their hash rate and park it into Erg. You're not only doing that, you're also asking them to decentralize enough of their total hash rate across various mining pools. You're also asking them to responsibly vote on EIP proposals. And then I realized, like, hey, I'd like to think I'm an active community member, but it's like these responsibilities are huge, and you do have to give those people, you have to treat them like adults. You can't just treat them as people that are just mining because we're trying to get to the, you know, to the point of saturation of the total coin supply where, hey, Ergo is going to be $100 and we're going to moon in 5 years, you know? And, you know, guilty as charged. You kind of look ahead and you look at the supply drop or the block reward drop, and you look at Bitcoin, and you're like, well, there's only one direction this price per Erg can go, but that responsibility is huge. And you, as much as you try to educate people and guide people, or Alex or anybody else, at the end of the day, these anonymous players are the ones that are controlling the keys to the kingdom. And it's an awesome experiment. It's very democratic because anybody can do it. You don't need to have a centralized Bitcoin farm, ASIC farm, but it's incredibly, you know, it's such a huge responsibility because all the work you guys are doing and everybody else has done, it's hanging technically by a very precarious thread, which is miners. It's always miners.
That's why I talk about we need to incentivize our miners. We need to take care of our miners. And the reality is, aside from security, miners do something that is huge for our network. And that is, they are the ones that essentially are responsible for token distribution, and they take first custody of the asset that's created.
Yeah.
Where, you know, that is fundamental to proof of work. Now, I get that, you know, you have issues with Ethereum in terms of like gas fees, and, you know, users then suddenly see, you know, miners as predatory, and it's true that, you know, sometimes miners will set their rig and kind of focus on life and maintenance and not follow things as, you know, diligently as we would hope. But the reality is they have input costs to cover. And that's something that, for me, I'm, you know, long term, what's the best thing I can do for Ergo? Make happy miners.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how that'll play out as Ethereum eventually gets their differentiated consensus layer. They don't like to call it ETH 2.0 anymore. They call it the new consensus layer.
You know, we will get miners that just mine to exchanges and exit when it's profitable. And I'm sure we'll also get a certain subset that the first thing they do is they get a wallet And then they start to poke around and explore the ecosystem. And we may even get some that get a wallet, poke around the ecosystem, learn about ErgoScript, and start to contribute. And so I would love to see, more engagement from that mining community, just because they do have real world cost skin in the game. And I think that inviting them into the ecosystem, making sure they understand kind of the power that they have in Ergo, which is unique, is going to long term be what drives and protects GPU mineable proof of work, which, in terms of like what is built, could anybody have predicted, 5 years ago that we were going to have a decentralized network that was selling $1 million pictures of monkeys? I doubt it. But in terms of principles, I think, that is something. Local computation is going to be increasingly important if we want to create resilient systems.
Yeah, not enough credit given to proof of work. It's all been thrown. The longest standing resilient system has been Bitcoin, the one that pioneered it. You would think people would give it a little more credit in terms of how nobody has hacked it. And although there have been a lot of, there's a lot of scaling problems. There's only so much you can forecast if you're developing that in 2008, 2009, and predict long-term ramification, then just kind of leave it in the hand of, yeah.
As like the Ergo Foundation, it's not our goal to be a steward of the network in terms of steering where it's going to go. What we need to do is we need to make sure that we build the right tools to support developers, and we promote the right principles, and then we create a pathway where the community can educate themselves, and hopefully it creates more of a self-reinforcing system, at which point we become less and less and less important.
Speaking of that, do you think there will ever be a point where I'm looking at my question right now. Can we expect to see further transparency of the foundation's 4.5%, roughly 4.5% allocation of the total ERG supply in the future? And not only can we expect more transparency, can we expect also more transparency on how those funds will be utilized in the future?
Sure. There are certain areas where you run into roadblocks. I'll use the example like exchanges, right? Exchange listings aren't necessarily free, and I can't disclose that. If I did, I would put us at risk of, potentially being delisted. So there are certain areas where it's usually due to counterparties that we can't, be too open and transparent. Otherwise, we could create a problem for the ecosystem as a whole. But that's certainly something that we're marching towards. Banking as a crypto foundation is really complex, and it's still something that we are working with, especially when you have a globally distributed team. We have, a board member that's in the United States. We have a board member that's in Russia. We have a board member that's in China. And so sometimes, we get into these meetings, and, the regulatory aspect of it, people are kind of confused, like, wait, how do you guys know each other? So what's going on here? You know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily fit the standard picture, because we are a global network. And so when you get into the tribalism between countries and geopolitics and all of that, sometimes it gets messy.
Right. So that'll be coming to some degree. Yep. The degree that
that's something that is critical. You have to push for transparency. Trust is everything.
Right. So to wrap up here, proof of work and ASIC resistant blockchain protocols are kind of the ones that are still relevant, are few and far in between. And we see ERG shaping up with a lot of other prominent players like Nervos Network and Flux. For those that don't know Flux, their use case is essentially being decentralized cloud infrastructure and a Web3 node provider. Do you think something like what Flux is doing could ever exist on Ergo's blockchain natively?
Well, I guess you know, if I look at like Ethereum, you do have some storage solutions that are tokenized on Ethereum that, you know, offer some service. There are actually a couple of them. It's hard to say. Does it make sense? You know, to be honest, I don't really know that much about that project in terms of like their economic incentive and vision. I don't know why they have a centralized wallet that's private, Zelcore. I looked into it actually hosting something on Flux, and I saw that and was like, I'm just gonna wait, see if
are you allowed to use a different wallet? I know
I don't
a little
know.
bit about Zelcore, but not so much.
Yeah, I don't know. I ran into that and was like, oh, that's weird, and then just rotated. I got too much other things to do, to be honest. Could it be built on Ergo? Probably, but you know, again, you get back to incentives. You have to incentivize that, and does that make sense? What's the long-term economic plan for that? Does it make sense? It's a hard question.
Yeah,
you know,
why make another? Why make
well,
another? Why have another car manufacturer if this one works? There has to be some sort of differentiated, unique value proposition to that.
Yeah, a product of decentralization is inefficiency. What's the cheapest way to host something? You centralize it, you scale it to market, and you get Amazon Web Services. You're never going to be more efficient than that in terms of a decentralized system because it's more inefficient by nature. Now, there is a trade-off, and that is the resiliency aspect. And then you have to say, okay, well, how do you create economic incentives that bring actors to participate in something that is more inefficient, but they have kind of the value proposition to do so? That's a hard question. You know, so can I say like that has been solved as a whole? No, I can't even say Ergo has solved that. That's a continual experiment, and it's why our industry exists.
Yeah. So currently, May of 2022, we're having the ErgoHack Fest. And that's a 3-week competition to get people kind of started on new ecosystem development and new initiatives and look beyond what's already been made, hopefully in the rest of in the DeFi space as well. What are you most excited based on the development teams that are currently already formed and the sort of like the ideas and proposals out there?
We're only 2 days into it. You know what excites me the most, to be honest, about ErgoHack? I love the fact that you always have, number one, developer interaction. So, you know, even somebody that is new or learning, you know, gets to talk to the core developer of protocol. Alex will always come in and, you know, what do you guys need? What are you doing? That's really cool thing to see. You know, the second thing is when in previous events, what I've seen is you have person A that's on team A that is helping team B. And, you know, that to me says a lot in terms of like the maturity and just mindset of let's build stuff and understand how to do things right.
Yeah.
You know, versus, you know, okay, you have a little bit of money on the table and then suddenly everybody gets a little bit animalistic and, you know, that could go a very different way. And I haven't seen that in ErgoHack. So
I think it comes from like knowing that Alex has been in this space so long. He's helped form many projects, and then he's voluntarily creating something that is meant for the everyday person to use. That creates a precedent. It's almost like Roger Federer in terms of like tennis etiquette. If the number one player, one of the best players in that field, professionally, is humble enough to present themselves in such a way, where do you get off acting any differently? So I feel like that sort of like ethos of collaboration, helpfulness comes from the beginning of just the developer just creating this open source thing when he could, you know, potentially have started from a very different type of a position You know, why not create a Terra Luna? Why not create something that may not that may just help your bottom line, which would be most people their wallets, versus creating something that is going to be tremendously more intricate, complex, and is going to depend on a lot of trust from other parties that you don't even know yet when you know you have all of this knowledge. So I feel like that's where it comes from. You have this, you know, genius dev at the top. Now smaller ones, or the ones looking to build, you have no other starting point than to you know, when he leads from an example, like, hey, let's all help each other out so we can build more and expand the ecosystem. Would you agree with that notion?
Yeah, you're going to be talking to Alex soon, right?
Yes, sir.
I would, you know, I would recommend you ask him simply about intent. What is his intent? And I think that ultimately, the intent that people come into things with really is reflected in the outcome they experience.
Right.
You know, and so I think that, you know, my conversations and interactions have always led me to see that his intent is to try to build something that simply offers an alternative that protects people. That's the end goal. You know, whether or not it's, you know, sexy or, you know, has the greatest marketing has never really been that. There's never been the concern. It's simply, okay, if we could build a system that's unstoppable, delivers solid tools that people can use to protect themselves from the external vulnerabilities in the sea of financial chaos that we're all in, that would be amazing. So hopefully, you know, with the community that is, you know, forming and building on this protocol, we can build solutions where people have simply an alternative that they understand and that, you know, is open and auditable and accountable. That would be the ideal, in my opinion, but you should ask him about that. I think that would be a really good conversation to have.
Yeah, I definitely will. So finally, to wrap it up, what does a typical workday look like for you? Like, yeah.
I wake up and I am like 7 hours behind because, you know, it's a global team, right? And then sometimes, you know, it pushes me into late into the night because then I'm waiting for them to wake up to kind of catch them on the other side of their day. So, you know, when you have a globally distributed team and, you know, you have partners that are sometimes in Asia or, you know, Russia or Europe, there's a lot of time juggling.
Yeah, you could be in a more favorable time zone if you're as the business manager, for sure. That would kind of correspond with people that are in Asia or in Europe. Sure. Like Dan is in Japan. I mean, you know, you have the cards you're dealt with, but
exactly.
You know, you're on the western side of the hemisphere.
And you know, I always try to take some time during the day to at least hop in and engage with the community, to check different channels, to see what you know, the consensus is. So anybody out there is always welcome to try to engage me. I might, you know, not get to it right away, but I think that that level of access and just interaction is important. I don't want to be somebody that's like off in the ivory tower making big decisions for the network. I want to be somebody that's kind of on the ground and understands the complexity of mining and what's the attitude of the general community and what do the developers need, and really try to service that. Yeah. So, you know, it depends day to day. Sometimes you have external madness. Sometimes you have internal madness. Sometimes you have, you know, peaceful green days, but you just wake up and you gotta be ready for whatever the day throws at you.
Yeah. Well, be careful on how that takes a toll on you mentally. It's a lot of pressure.
That's why I unplug, you know, if I'm in airplane mode, you know, the reality is like my little bubble extends to like the end of my arms, you know, all of that doesn't exist in that moment, and just enjoy what I'm doing. And, you know, I come back to it and I know that the internet is not like Twitter is a perfect example. You can't win Twitter. That's like, what's that Star Trek test that you can't win? Kobayashi Maru, I think is the name of it, where like they test pilots by putting them in a losing situation. I just see social media as kind of a losing situation where there's no way I can win day to day to day or be popular day to day to day, but I can have principles and try to I don't know, just say be kind and understand things.
Yeah, I think of politicians, even with the most well-intentioned politician, even getting their way, there's always going to be, even if they do a substantial net good, you're never going to please everybody.
No, but you can have principles, right? And I
Yes.
think that's the most important thing to preserve and protect is like, okay, why are we building this ecosystem? Why are we building this network? What is the intent? And then how can we really be true to that? And I think that's something that really is not for me to even fully discover and just like say. It's for each person to say, okay, what does that represent for them? And then how can they build something with principle? Because ultimately, you know, nobody cares about who develops on your phone, right? They just look at the apps and what they do, and that becomes the focus. The back end becomes less and less and less important as the front end becomes more complex. So at some point, I'll probably, you know, fade into the background, which is great. Hopefully, at some point, I work myself out of a job to where I'm not even needed in the ecosystem, and it becomes sustainable. I'll still probably try to stay around and help out, and you know, participate. But I hope that I'm just a temporary necessary evil as things bootstrap, and then I get out of the way.
Well, that's an incredible place to stop. I want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate you taking roughly 2 hours to engage with just another member of the community.
I appreciate you taking 2 hours to make a video, you know?
Well, you know, I've always seen you in the Friday AMAs, and your response, you seem to have a response for everything. Every question that the community throws, you have a thoughtful, well, like you're thinking long term, even if the question is short term, is kind of pivoted towards a short term narrative, and it shows. And it's not easy as a human being to always be consistent with, I suppose, the ethos and the philosophy of a blockchain that's inherently decentralized, and just try to keep your character as much out of the picture as possible, but still keep enough where people can see you as a human being and relate to what you're saying. So it's like a weird balance that has to be struck.
Well, I think the main reason why I am where I am in terms of working with Alex and working with the Ergo Foundation is because I understand and would like to support the intent of what Ergo is trying to do. Just that simple. So, you know, yeah, we always have short-term madness, and you know, sometimes the markets move over here and then over here, and a lot of people, you know, are continually trying to, I don't know, chase that return. But really, it's to me, it's like, okay, what's the intent and what are the principles? And if we stay true to that and we build on top of that the right way, long term, we're going to build what we want to build.
Yeah, I think that's reflective of the community. I mean, I know hundreds of cryptocurrencies prior to, I'm familiar with, at least in a rudimentary nature, with hundreds of cryptocurrencies prior to finding Ergo. And I can say uniquely from my personal perspective, when the price of ERG goes down, or the market corrects, or whatever happens in the real world, that scares people, I don't see too many community members panicking. I don't see too many of them talking about price to begin with. And it's like like how I said, just leading by example. If you guys aren't worried about price, and you guys ultimately have the biggest responsibility along with the miners,
yeah,
it's kind of like, why even have that conversation on Twitter when maybe in 2 weeks we'll be back at whatever price we were before, or so on and so forth. It's such a resilient community that's being built here based on the people that are kind of helping to keep the training wheels on it, so it can kind of take off on the runway on its own.
I think it boils down to just having stable principles and a stable intent.
And a
There's a
stable
lot.
coin that's stable.
Well, I mean, if you know what you're doing and you understand the purpose of why,
Yeah.
it kind of grounds you from a lot of volatility around you. Like
Yeah.
I'm not here for, the event of the week. So it can happen. I don't have any control over it. There's a lot of over leverage and, just madness out there. There's a lot of inflation in the economy. What do you want me to do about it? I'm not, I can worry about it, but ultimately I don't have any power there. And so I just say, okay, well, where is my power useful and what's my purpose there? And then focus there. And I think that long term, if we can, stay true to first principles, if we can really promote, let's say, the right methods of development, and we can encourage the community as a whole to ask the right questions, understand risk, and hold people, projects accountable versus, see the YouTuber with their mouth open and then spend their life savings on something. That will serve us long term. So that's ideally, kind of the culture and community we're trying to create.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are hungry for that too. You don't want to see clickbaity, stupid arrows going up on some random coin. It does get tiresome. It gets really old. I wouldn't say very quickly, but it gets old after a year or two. I'd like to think, it just gets old. You want to have real conversations. How are we going to improve? Look at all the things going on in the world are going sideways. How can we innovate past the constraints of the way things have traditionally been done? And that's like ultimately the conversation I think people need to have more of, instead of chasing and chasing and chasing, because ultimately you're going to be winded and you're not going to end up with anything.
Well, from my own experience of like knowing where I am stupid and asking for help, one thing that I've kind of learned from experience is generally the people that I find the most valuable to listen to understand complexity and challenges versus just have an answer.
Yes. So with that note, again, I thank you so much for your time. And I know the community values your contribution to the ecosystem and overall, and just asking more questions than necessarily having answers. And that's completely fine. And thank you so much for your time.
That was a pleasure.